My parents took $20,000 from retirement for my sister, then tried to hike my rent, so I moved out and left them to handle her mess alone. I'm an ordinary 25-year-old who worked hard to graduate from college and get my first job as an elementary school teacher. It's not a high-paying position, but I enjoy dealing with children, so it's worthwhile. Still, money is tight, especially when you're just starting out. That's why I've been living with my parents in the suburban house where I grew up. It's not the most fascinating configuration, but it is functional. They charge me a decent rent, as my father would say, and I buy my own groceries. In addition, when Dad broke his back last summer, I helped with jobs such as mowing the grass, fixing things around the house, and even cleaning out the garage. It is not glamorous, but it is only transitory. My objective was to stay for a few years, save money, and eventually get my own place. Simple, right? It was straightforward until my older sister Brielle re-entered the picture. Brielle is 32, and to put it simply, she has never been the responsible type. She was the best-behaved child growing up. I'm not sure if it was because she was the firstborn, or if our parents simply liked her, but she could do no wrong in their eyes. She dropped out of college twice. The first time she wasn't motivated. The second time she complained that the lecturers were overly demanding. She has never held a job for more than a few months. When things didn't go her way, she'd resign and make up an excuse about how it wasn't her fault. Our parents constantly helped her out. Are you late on your rent? They would pay for it. Did your car break down? They'd cover the fix. Have you received a speeding ticket? Mom would write the check, mumbling about how the police target young ladies. Meanwhile, I was cleaning toilets at a diner to save money for college and taking out loans to pay for school. Brielle had been living on her own for the previous few years, or so I assumed. It turned out she'd been bouncing between apartments, constantly overdue on rent, and relying on our parents to keep her afloat. I had no idea about this until she walked up one day and casually disclosed her pregnancy. Now, I'm not here to pass judgment on anyone's life choices, but let's just say Brielle's circumstances were far from stable. The kid's father was a guy she'd been dating for a few months, and from what I could tell, he wasn't very happy about the surprise pregnancy. He basically vanished as soon as she told him. You'd think Brielle would take this as a wake-up call, right? Perhaps this was the moment she realized she needed to organize her life. But no. Instead, she ran directly to Mom and Dad, who immediately went into repair mode. Within a week, they began renovating the basement to make it into a little apartment for her. They even installed a kitchenette. I didn't ask where the money was coming from, but I overheard Mom mention tapping into their retirement savings. I tried to stay out of it because, frankly, it wasn't my concern. They could choose to throw money at Brielle, but the truth is, I could already see the writing on the wall. My parents have a habit of bringing everyone else into Brielle's difficulties. It's as if they believe we all have to join together to help her, regardless of how big of a disaster she's created. At first, I assured myself that it wouldn't bother me. Brielle's small apartment was being built in the basement, giving her her own space. I assumed she'd move in, do her thing, and I'd continue on with my life. It was a little frustrating to see everyone bend over backwards for her again, but I tried not to focus on it. That mindset was effective for roughly 2 months, then tiny things began to pile up. First, Mom started telling me that I should spend more time with Brielle because she was going through so much, despite the fact that I was working full-time and came home weary most days. Then began the subtle guilt trips. Mom would say things like, "You know Brielle doesn't have anyone else to lean on right now. It's so hard being pregnant and single." She'd do this while looking directly at me as if I was meant to miraculously cure all of Brielle's issues. Dad wasn't doing much better. He would find ways to incorporate Brielle into every conversation. "You should be grateful for everything you have, Riley," he'd add as he passed the salt during supper. "Not everyone's as lucky as you." Fortunately, I was barely getting by, trying to create a career while saving money. Meanwhile, Brielle was given a completely refurbished flat, as well as unending emotional and financial assistance. But things escalated when I overheard Mom and Dad talking one night. They were in the living room, and I was in the kitchen, making tea. "She's going to need a lot of help once the baby comes," she remarked. "Of course," Dad responded. "We'll all pitch in." "All?" Mom inquired. "Well, you, me, and Riley," Dad stated, as if it were clear. I almost dropped my mug. They hadn't told me anything about this plan, but it was evident they had already determined I would be a part of it. That's when I started feeling apprehensive. I didn't know the specifics yet, but I could tell they were working on something that would drag me into Brielle's mess whether I liked it or not. Brielle's frequent visits exacerbated the unpleasant sensation. She'd collapse onto the couch, whining about how difficult it was to be pregnant and how terrible it was that her ex had left. She'd make passing remarks about how fortunate I was to have a stable job and no children to worry about. I bit my tongue every time since I didn't want to spark an argument. But in the back of my mind I kept thinking, why does this always fall on me? By dinner time that night I had a horrible feeling that something was about to happen. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it wouldn't be good. When we sat down to supper, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. You know when everyone is acting too casual, like if they are all keeping a secret from you? That is how it felt. Mom and Dad were conversing about random topics regarding the neighbor's new fence while Brielle was going through her phone. It felt forced, as if they were waiting for the proper time to dump something on me. Dinner was spaghetti, which is my father's go-to "we need to have a family talk" food. I'm not sure why. It's not as if spaghetti makes terrible news easier to digest. I tried to concentrate on my plate and not overthink things, but around midway through the dinner, Mom cleared her throat. "So, we've been thinking," she said, looking at Dad. I froze. Nothing good ever comes from those words. "With Brielle moving back home, she's going to need some help," Mom said, her tone too kind. "What exactly do you need help with?" I inquired, attempting to maintain a neutral tone. Dad jumped in before she could respond. "With the baby, of course. Brielle's got a lot on her plate right now, and it's going to be hard for her to manage everything on her own." I looked across at Brielle, who was still scrolling through her phone as if this topic had nothing to do with her. She did not even look up. "Okay, but what does that have to do with me?" I inquired, setting down my fork. My parents exchanged one of those expressions, as if they were trying to find out how to frame whatever they were going to say. "Well," my mom said, "you're already living here, and you're so good with kids being a teacher and all. We thought it made sense for you to help with babysitting." "Help?" I asked again, lifting an eyebrow. Dad nodded warmly. "Yeah, just keep an eye on the baby while Brielle gets back on her feet. It wouldn't be full-time or anything, just when you're home." I couldn't believe what I heard. "You want me to babysit a newborn on top of working full-time?" "Well, you're home for 3 more days," Mom pointed out. "And you're not paying market rent," Dad said, as if that were relevant. I glanced at them, trying to understand what they were asking. They weren't just asking for a little assistance. They expected me to take on an entire second job for free. "Wait, let me get this straight," I murmured, leaning back in my chair. "You want me to come home from teaching all day and then take care of Brielle's baby?" Mom sighed, as if I was being difficult on purpose. "It's not like that, Riley. We're all going to pitch in." "All?" I repeated. "Yes," Dad answered. "We're all family, and family helps each other." At that point, Brielle looked up from her phone. "Wow, Riley," she exclaimed, smirking. "I didn't realize helping your sister was such a big deal for you." I felt my hands twist into fists beneath the table. I didn't want to snap, but the entitlement in her voice was too much. "It's not about that," I replied. "I have my own life, my own job. I can't just drop everything to babysit." "You're being selfish," Mom started with a harsh tone. "Brielle's going through a really hard time right now. The least you can do is help her out." "Why is it my responsibility to fix her choices?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "She's 32 years old. She's not a kid anymore." Brielle gave me a "Are you kidding me? Look, that's enough," Dad remarked, his voice stern. "We're all in this together, whether you like it or not. You're living under our roof, and we expect you to contribute." "Family," I answered. "I pay rent. I buy my own groceries. I help with chores. How is that not enough?" The room went silent for a time and I could feel the tension in the air. Brielle merely sat there complacent as if she had already won. "Well," Mom replied, "if you're not willing to help, maybe we need to rethink your living arrangement." My stomach sank. Are you threatening to kick me out? Of course not, Mom replied hastily. But if you're not willing to contribute more, maybe we need to discuss raising your rent. I couldn't believe what I heard. I had done everything I could to be a good renter, if you can call it that, and now they were trying to guilt me into taking on duties that were not mine. You're seriously going to do this? I questioned, my voice shaking. You're going to punish me for not wanting to be Brielle's free nanny. It's not punishment, Dad explained. It's about being part of the family. It's about you two enabling Brielle like you always have, I replied, rising from the table. And now you're trying to drag me into it. Don't talk about your sister like that, Mom yelled. I'm done, I said, turning towards the stairs. You want to help Brielle? Fine, but leave me out of it. I raced upstairs and shut the door to my room, my heart thumping against my chest. I could not believe what had just occurred. I had always known my parents preferred Brielle, but this was a whole other level. It seemed like it was about control. They intended to keep me under their roof so they could coerce me into doing whatever they wanted. The most memorable aspect of the conversation for me was Brielle's smug expression. She barely said anything and sat there browsing through her phone as if nothing was wrong. And I suppose in her opinion, it wasn't. Mom and Dad were already going out of their way to appease her, and now they were attempting to bring me into it as well. I don't think I slept for more than a few hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the conversation in my thoughts, remembering everything I should have said but didn't. I was still upset when my alarm went off the next morning, but I also felt trapped. I couldn't just leave. I considered packing up my belongings and getting my own home, but it wasn't that simple. I was only a few months into my teaching profession and still attempting to save money. Rent in the neighborhood was too expensive, and I couldn't afford to live alone on my wage. The next few days were tense at home. Mom and Dad were definitely upset with me, but instead of discussing it, they started making passive-aggressive comments. Must be nice to have so much free time after work, Mom commented one evening as I stepped through the door. Yeah, some people don't have that luxury, Dad explained, barely glancing up from his newspaper. I ignored them and walked directly to my room. At this time, I was not interested in disputing. I knew that anything I said would only make matters worse, and I didn't have the energy to deal with it. Brielle, meantime, was living her best life. She hadn't even moved in yet she was there virtually every day, filling the living room with her belongings and acting as if she already owned the home. She'd leave her shoes on the couch, her handbag on the dining table, and odd shopping bags strewn about like it was no great deal. I got home one night to find her on the couch, eating ice cream and watching a reality show. She didn't even recognize me when I entered. She looked up, gave me a half-hearted hey, and returned to her TV. I stood there for a second, hoping for her to say something else, either an apology or simply a thank you for not freaking out about the situation. But nothing. I walked to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and discovered that half of my groceries were missing. What about the bread I bought? Gone. What about yogurt? Gone. Even my leftovers from the night before were gone. Did you eat my food? I questioned, returning to the living room. Brielle did not even look up. Mom said I could, she said between bites of ice cream. She's not the one who paid for it, I snapped. Brielle eventually turned to face me and rolled her eyes. Chill out, Riley, it's just food. It's my food, I replied, my voice rising. If you want groceries, go buy your own. Geez, you don't have to be such a drama queen, Brielle replied, placing her bowl on the coffee table. You're acting like I stole your car or something. I did not know what to say. I just stood there angry while Brielle grabbed her phone and began messaging someone, completely ignoring me again. I wanted to yell at her for being entitled and selfish, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Brielle had spent her entire life getting away with this kind of conduct because Mom and Dad allowed it, and now they were attempting to make me part of the problem. The next morning, Mom cornered me in the kitchen as I was preparing coffee. You need to apologize to your sister, she replied sternly. For what? I inquired, honestly perplexed. For making her feel unwelcome, Mom stated, crossing her arms. She's going through so much right now, and the last thing she needs is you being difficult. Are you serious? I asked, turning to face her. She ate all my food and acted like it was no big deal. How is that my fault? Mom sighed as if I were the one acting unreasonable. It's just food, Riley. You can always buy more. That's not the point, I responded, attempting to keep my voice steady. The point is that she doesn't respect anyone's boundaries and you're letting her get away with it. Boundaries? Mom asked, practically scoffing. This is her home now too. You need to learn how to share. At that point, I realized I couldn't reason with her. Mom wasn't interested in hearing my side of the story. She just wanted me to conform and do what was best for the family. Over the next week, things deteriorated. Mom and Dad began hinting that if I didn't step up, they would hike my rent. Brielle continued to move more of her belongings into the house, filling the basement with furniture and boxes. She even started using my bathroom because the one below didn't work well. I tried to keep my distance, but it seemed that no matter what I did, they were all out to lure me into their mess. One night, I came home to find Dad in the living room, holding what appeared to be a financial worksheet. "We need to talk," he continued, motioning for me to sit down. I hesitated, but eventually sat on the edge of the couch, bracing myself for what would come next. "We've been looking at the numbers," Dad said, tapping the paper with his pen. "And with Brielle moving in, expenses are going up. We think it's only fair for you to contribute more." "You're already charging me rent," I responded. "How much more do you want?" Dad shrugged. "We're still figuring that out. But if you're not willing to help with the baby, this seems like the best solution." I couldn't believe what I heard. They were literally attempting to use my rent as leverage to get me to babysit. "This is ridiculous," I exclaimed, standing up. "I'm already paying more than enough for what I get here. If you want me to leave, just say so." "No one's asking you to leave," Dad responded hurriedly. "We're just asking you to do your part." "My part," I repeated. "You mean Brielle's part?" Dad opened his lips to react, but I did not allow him the opportunity. I walked out of the room and directly into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. At that time, I realized I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't stay living in a place where my boundaries were ignored, and my parents treated me like cheap labor. I didn't know how or when, but I knew one thing for certain: I needed to get away. That thought lingered with me, becoming louder every time Brielle waltzed through the home as if she owned it, or Mom and Dad tried to pressure me into helping. But wanting to leave and really doing it were two very different things. I didn't have much saved, but not enough to comfortably buy my own house, and the prospect of abruptly uprooting my life seemed overwhelming. Still, I realized that staying was not an option. If I let them push me into becoming Brielle's backup parent now, it would never end. They'd just keep piling more and more on me until I was stuck. I didn't want to wake up 5 years later in that house, unhappy and bitter. The next morning, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down with my computer. I opened a spreadsheet to manage my budget, which included rent, groceries, petrol, and school debts. I wasn't a terrific saver, but I did set aside some money every month. I tallied everything up and realized I could afford to move if I found somewhere cheap and cut up on luxuries for a bit. The timing could not have been better. My coworker Harper indicated a few weeks ago that she was seeking a roommate. I hadn't given it much attention at the time, but now it feels like a lifeline. I sent her a text, "Hey, is that roommate thing still an option?" She very quickly responded, "Yep, still looking." "Why? Are you interested?" "Yeah, maybe. Can we talk after work?" Harper's reaction was brief and simple. "Of course." That afternoon, I stayed late at school, waiting until the halls were quiet before entering Harper's classroom. She was sitting at her desk, grading papers. "What's up?" she inquired, glancing up from her stack of writings. I paused for a second, unsure how much to share. At last, I responded, "I'm thinking about moving out of my parents' place. They're making things complicated." Harper nodded as if she knew without me having to explain. "The offer is still open," she explained. "It's not a big place, but it's clean, and we'd split everything down the middle. Rent's $800 a month, utilities included." That was slightly higher than I had hoped for, but it was manageable. "When would you need someone to move in?" I asked you. "Yesterday," she said, adding, "but seriously, anytime. If you're in, the room's yours." I promised her I'd let her know by the end of the week, but my mind was already made up. This was my way out. Then I had to find out how to leave without causing any more fuss. If my folks learned about my plan too soon, I knew they'd try to undermine it. They'd guilt me, quarrel with me, and possibly even raise my rent immediately to prevent me from saving anything. So I stayed quiet. I began packing gradually, focusing on staples, clothing, personal items, and everything I couldn't afford to replace. I kept everything in the trunk of my car, hidden under a blanket in case anyone was curious. At the same time, I began documenting everything, just in case. I photographed my room, my furniture, and my equipment, anything that could become a source of controversy later. I knew from experience that Betrayal had a habit of forgetting who owned what, and I didn't want to lose my belongings in the confusion of leaving. One night, while everyone was sleeping, I printed up a letter formally delivering my 30-day notice. I'd done some online research and discovered that, while I wasn't exactly a tenant in the legal sense, it was still a good idea to get everything in writing. The last thing I wanted was for them to accuse me of leaving without warning. I didn't get much sleep that night, continuously checking the clock and listening for any sounds that could indicate someone was awake. Finally, at 6 a.m., I slipped the envelope under the door to my parents' bedroom. The reaction was quick. When I arrived home from work that day, Mom and Dad were waiting for me in the living room. "What's this?" Dad questioned, holding up the letter as if it were a personal attack. "It's my notice," I said in a firm voice. "You're really doing this?" Mom inquired, her voice already trembling. "Yes," I replied forcefully. "I found a place and I'll be moving out by the end of the month." "You can't just leave," Mom explained. "What about Betrayal? What about the baby?" I took a deep breath and tried to remain cool. Betrayal and the baby aren't my responsibility. I've done everything I can to help around here, but I can't keep living like this. "What's wrong with you?" Dad asked, his voice rising. "You weren't stubborn like this before. We've given you so much letting you live here, helping you get on your feet, and this is how you repay us." I clenched my fists and held back the temptation to roar. "I pay rent," I responded with gritted teeth. "I buy my own food. I've been responsible for myself since the day I graduated. I'm not a kid anymore, and I'm not your backup plan for Betrayal." Mom began crying, which did not surprise me. She would always cry when things didn't go her way. "How can you do this to us?" she cried. "To your sister?" I did not say anything. I realized there was no point. They wouldn't listen, and I was not going to change my views. The days that followed were among the most embarrassing of my life. Mom and Dad hardly spoke to me except for the occasional guilt trip. Betrayal pretended nothing had changed and continued to take over the house as if it were already hers. I returned home one night to find that she had relocated more of her belongings into the basement, putting boxes on top of the couch and pushing clothes into the closet. She seemed to be staking her territory, claiming every inch of available space. "Hope you don't mind," she said as I stepped in. I did not respond. I simply went upstairs and shut the door to my room, ignoring the knot of rage swelling in my chest. In the final days before my move, I stepped up my preparations. I packed the last of my belongings, double-checked my budget, and made arrangements with Harper to pick up the keys. Everything was coming into place, yet I still had a nagging feeling of worry. The worst thing was the morning I officially moved out. I'd arranged for Harper to stop by with her car, and we'd pick up the remaining of my belongings before traveling to her place. I thought I'd planned it precisely so that Betrayal would still be asleep and Mom and Dad would be too preoccupied with their morning chores to notice me. Of course, nothing ever goes as easily in my family. I was halfway through moving boxes to my car when I heard my father's slippers shuffling down the hallway. He emerged at the top of the stairs. "What are you doing?" he demanded. I did not stop moving. "I told you I'm leaving today," I muttered, taking another box and heading out the door. "You can't just sneak out like this," he exclaimed, following me outside. "We're a family, Riley. Are you abandoning your own family?" I placed the package in the trunk of my car and turned to face him. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I responded calmly. "I'm choosing to live my own life. There's a difference." Dad appeared to want to quarrel, but before he could say anything, Mom arrived at the doorway, arms crossed and tears flowing down her cheeks. "You're really doing this?" she questioned, her voice cracking. "Yes," I replied, firmly keeping my stance. What about Brielle? She asked, sobbing. What about the baby? I sighed, feeling the weight of the conversation bear down on me. Mom, I've told you before that Brielle and the baby aren't my problem. I can't keep sacrificing my own life to fix her mistakes. That set her off. How dare you talk about your sister like that? She demanded, her voice rising. She's doing the best she can. I said, is she? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she's just waiting for everyone else to do the work for her. Brielle appeared from the basement, disheveled but alert. She smirked as she watched the scenario develop in the driveway. Don't worry, Mom, she added, her voice full of cynicism. If Riley wants to be selfish, let her. We don't need her anyway. I clenched my fists, resisting the temptation to strike back. Instead, I looked at Harper, who had just arrived in her car. Let's get this done, I murmured, disregarding the commotion behind me. Harper offered me a compassionate look before starting to assist me move the rest of my belongings into the cars. My parents continued to quarrel in the background, using every guilt trip they could think of. Who's going to help us now? Dad exclaimed. How can you be so heartless? Mom cried. Brielle, meanwhile, leaned against the doorframe, observing everything as if it were a live play for her entertainment. By the time we finished loading everything, I felt like I had run a marathon. I stood in the driveway, taking one last look at the house I had lived in for so many years. It should have been a bittersweet moment, but instead I felt relieved. With that, I started the engine and drove away, Harper following closely behind. I felt immediate comfort when I parked into Harper's apartment complex. It was not fancy, but it was clean, peaceful, and, most importantly, free of drama. Harper assisted me in carrying everything inside, and I was unpacked and established into my new room in less than an hour. We sat on the couch afterward and talked about work. It felt normal, like a peek of the life I'd missed while trapped in the midst of my family's turmoil. But the tranquility lasted barely approximately 2 hours. My phone started vibrating non-stop with calls, texts, and voicemails. It was my parents, aunts, and cousins. My mother had apparently already spread the word that I had abandoned the family, and everyone had an opinion on the matter. Riley, how could you do this to your sister? One voicemail from my Aunt Denise began. She's pregnant and vulnerable. Don't you care about your family? Selfish doesn't even begin to describe you, another text from a cousin said. The worst aspect was Brielle's social media posts. She had gone into full victim mode, posting images of her baby belly with remarks like, "Some people would rather run away than help their own family. At least my baby will know what real love looks like." I blocked her immediately. It was infuriating, but I refused to let it draw me back in. I reminded myself that this was exactly why I'd left, to avoid the manipulation and drama that came with being a part of my family. The following week at work, things became more crazier. My mother arrived at school during my lunch break, crying and demanding to speak with me. She was in complete meltdown mode, ranting about how I had wrecked the family and how Brielle was breaking apart without me. My principal had to intervene and ask her to leave, which was embarrassing. I spent the rest of the day avoiding eye contact with everyone, knowing they were undoubtedly wondering about the family drama I was involved in. But the situation actually worked in my favor. I thought I was over the house and all the drama it brought, but life isn't that simple. About 2 weeks later, I realized I had left behind some vital documents, including my teaching credential, tax forms, and other work-related paperwork. I was so concentrated on getting out of the house that I forgot to double-check the small drawer where I usually stored such items. So, with my mother arriving at my school, I informed a couple of my coworkers about all that had been happening. They did not hesitate to step forward and offer their assistance. "Let us know when you're ready to grab the rest of your stuff," Harper added, handing me her extra car keys. "We'll make it quick." So, a few days later, Harper and another co-worker, Zoe, accompanied me to my parents' house to retrieve the remainder of my belongings. I thought I was prepared for whatever bullshit they would do, but I misjudged how low they were willing to go. When we arrived at my room, it was unrecognizable. Brielle had moved more of her belongings in, blending them with mine like a territorial takeover. Clothes that were not mine were pushed into my dresser. Random baby stuff was stacked on my desk, and my nightstand had been completely emptied and replaced with her belongings. "What's going on here?" I murmured to myself more than everyone else. Brielle arrived in the doorway clutching a cup of coffee and seeming quite unconcerned. "Oh hey," she replied casually as if nothing had happened. "I guess some of my stuff got mixed in. It's hard to tell what's yours and what's mine at this point." I stared at her, unable to grasp the chutzpah of her statement. "You mean the stuff that was in my room where I've been living for years?" She shrugged and sipped her coffee. "Well, you already left, so what does it matter?" It was evident she did this on purpose to make things more difficult for me, but what she didn't realize was that I had foreseen this precise scenario. I took out my phone and accessed the album containing images of my room taken before she moved there. "I already have photos of everything," I explained, putting the screen up for her to see. "And I made a list of all my stuff down to the serial numbers on my electronics." Brielle's face twisted in irritation, but before she could answer, Mom and Dad appeared. "What's going on?" Dad inquired. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice filled with rage. "I came to grab some stuff I forgot," I replied, trying to remain calm. "But Brielle is claiming she can't tell what's hers and what's mine. I have documentation for everything I own." Dad's expression hardened. "If you take anything that doesn't belong to you, I'll call the police." I laughed briefly and without humor. "Go ahead," I replied. "We can also talk to them about the legality of you entering my room without notice and tampering with my belongings." That silenced him. Harper and Zoe stepped in and helped me sort through the debris. Brielle attempted to fight when I picked up my laptop, saying it was hers, but all I had to do was provide the purchase documentation and a snapshot of the serial number. The more she realized her plan wouldn't work, the angrier she became. "This is so unfair," she exclaimed, throwing her fists in the air. "You're stealing from a pregnant woman." I turned to her, fed up. "The only person trying to steal anything here is you," I stated firmly. "Just like you've been trying to steal my time and my freedom by expecting me to be your unpaid nanny. Not anymore." I climbed into Harper's car and didn't look back. Now, it was 6 months ago. Brielle had the baby, and as I expected, everything is falling apart. My parents are now stuck providing the childcare they attempted to impose on me while working full-time jobs. They're fatigued and overwhelmed, according to the few family members who still communicate with me. Brielle hasn't even tried to find work. She claims she is too stressed to work, which is likely accurate, given that she spends the majority of her time reading through her phone and ignoring her obligations. She is still living at my parents' house, now with a crying newborn and an incomplete basement project that is depleting their retirement money. I've heard that they've made multiple attempts to reach me after my departure. First, I received a nasty SMS about being ungrateful. When that failed, they resorted to guilt trips about how much the baby needed me. The latest technique has been to send images of my niece with messages like, "Don't you want to meet your only niece?" and "She needs her aunt in her life." I've blocked them all on social media and set up email filters to prevent receiving their communications. A few family members who understand my situation have kept me updated, but I've made it clear that I'm not interested in mending connections unless my parents and Brielle admit their actions and make genuine adjustments. Ironically, if they had simply respected my limits and asked for occasional babysitting assistance like normal people, I would have likely obliged. I adore children and would have gladly assisted them at times, but their attempt to force me into full-time childcare while neglecting my privacy and liberty shattered any hope of that happening. And yes, that is my tale. What I learned from all of this is that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do for your family is to cease enabling their harmful conduct.